Hi, let's start Module 2 with the concept of social imaginaries and their utility to think different temporalities. Social imaginaries are sets of symbolic representations and ways of thinking and acting of a social group in its daily life. This can be analyzed from matrices that organize these representations into inclusive hierarchical levels. This method was created from the need for achieving a standard of organization of the ethnographic material, allowing comparison of social groups and case studies with each other, in order to get a synchronic result out of them. This emerges epistemologically from the analysis and reinterpretation of authors such as Padurai, Bachelard, Vasco, Castoriadis, Durand, Ricoeur, and Wright. If described in a simplified way, the method introduces three complementary levels of signification: constellation, the main imaginaries; component, the symbolic representation; and category, the discussed concepts. Matrices schematize the set of mapped representation to analyze the social dynamics of a single or several social groups. It is at the level of components where discrepancies leading to divergent significations of the same groupings of imaginaries that operate in the constellations are expressed. That is to say, for example, that for the same set of imaginaries as the constellation's future, different interpretations can be found at the level of components, such as temporality and predictions, and therefore they explain that the categories associated with these imaginaries differ to a lesser or a greater degree. Matrices of imaginaries provide a scheme of the symbolic field of the interlocutors arranged by the ethnographer in order to systematize interview, answers, conversations, and analysis of the respective discourses. Likewise, an ethnographic approach to the imaginaries necessarily entails considering the interlocutor's voice at the moment of designing the tool of analysis, and not necessarily this must measure and codify them for translating their logics, knowledge, and practices. The next stage is introducing the concept of development as temporality. Why development, a core imaginary of capitalism and contemporary life, could be thought as temporality? As we will see now, development is a rationalization of the apprehension of time that implies the three tensions of every temporality, that is, past, present, and future. To visualize it, let's consider the biological development of any living creature. The interpretation of the concept is always diachronic, as current development is understood in comparison to a previous stage, how it developed, or to a future stage, how it will develop. Although the term is not directly used, there are multiple allusions to the process of development in daily life, as it often happens in family contexts. For example, look how big your kid is, or how fast you grew up, or the town took off, it developed. In other contexts, economics, politics, or media, its use has often a negative connotation. For example, underdeveloped or developing countries, thus unable to balance their past with the present, or a positive one when mentioning overdeveloped sectors when their present is ahead of their future expected in later stages. Whatever expression is used, the semantic structure of the various definitions of development entails the three tensions of every temporality that has precise ontological characteristics, that is, linear, projective, and cumulative. As stated in Module 1, temporality is all human interpretation of becoming that sustains us in life, a becoming that has been assigned with multiple variations of what has historically called time. The indistinguishable use of time and temporality in everyday language, either in political, scientific, pedagogical, or media discourses, contributes to naturalize the same meaning for both concepts, therefore naturalizing the hegemonic temporality as the only possible way of thinking the phenomenon of time. The hegemonic temporality, understood as the conceptualization of Western linear time various process of officialization, is detected in the analysis of the Imaginaries when considering the existence of other temporalities responding to other logics and attitudes facing becoming, and not conceived as unique and univocal as was stated in Model 1. Likewise, development as a central concept of the hegemonic temporality is naturalized as a unique notion of the sense of life, individual and collective, when it is stated, for instance, among other similar expressions. For example, there is no progress without development. Interpreting development as temporality implies a notion that cannot be univocal, has a historical construction crossed by a process of officializations, and that by becoming hegemonic it imposes onto other notions, replacing, syncretizing, or removing them. The various notions of development are circumscribed to both the uses, daily practices, and the representation of the processes, temporality, allocations, spatiality, while the mentioned development occurs, is done and undone, is produced, managed, and consumed. In Claude Lévi-Strauss' words, a society is always a special temporal given, and therefore subject to the impact of other societies and of early states of its own development. The philosophical and scientific problematization of development withdraws in another horizon of problematics, that of the cultural discontinuities that goes back to the discovery of the New World in the 16th century European colonialism. Explained by the author, a unitary vision of the development of mankind emerges from the context of that process, conceived as a progression, regression, or a combination of both. Lévi-Strauss highlights that those societies which today we call underdeveloped are not such through their own doing, and one would be wrong to conceive of them as exterior to the Western development, or indifferent to it. In truth, they are various societies whose direct or indirect destructions between the 16th and the 19th century have made possible the development of the Western world. Considering the interpretation of development as temporality, the difference stated by Lévi-Strauss between cumulative history associated with progressive cultures and a stationary history associated with inert cultures can be found in our context in the stigmatizations attributed to market sectors or groups of producers which are not strictly functional to the serialized accumulation of capitalism. In fact, we can resignify those definitions to circumscribe at least two notions of development: the cumulative development associated to the hegemonic temporality of the Western capitalist mode of production and living, and the stationary development associated to originary temporalities with a different attitude towards becoming, lying far from the canon of accumulation and progress. Caution is required in this sense when types of development are remarked, as the author points out. At every occasion we are inclined to call a culture inert or stationary. We must therefore ask ourselves if that apparent immobility doesn't stem from our ignorance of its true interest, and if, with its own criteria, which are different from our own, that culture is not a victim of the same illusions with respect to us. Both notions of development, both temporalities, are neither diametrically parallelized nor impossible to find together in the same socio-territorial process. On the contrary, that we observe is a coexistence of modes of productions, living, developing. In short, coexisting in the same territory. We are able to visualize at the regional level what Lévi-Strauss qualified more than 50 years ago at the world level, what today we call global. No world civilizations can exist because civilization implies the coexistence of cultures offering among themselves the maximum of diversity and even consists in this very coexistence. All cultural progress depends on a coalition of cultures. To sum up, development is a constellation of imaginaries rather than a specific practice. It is an interpretation of becoming and matter, and specifically on how things unfold in the becoming. Development, as well as progress, is an imaginary of the becoming. We see a blooming plant and say, it is developing, it evolved. Or when comparing groups of similar plants or animals, it is usually said, here we can clearly see how these species develop. Although obviating in this reasoning that the term evolution is a component of the imaginary development, which then implies an evolutionist interpretation of biological change, as if there were no others.